For more than a century, the phrase "up the river" meant only one thing: a one-way trip to a fortress on the banks of the Hudson, where 614 men and women would die strapped to a wooden chair. Sing Sing wasn't just a prison. It was a machine built to break human beings, designed around total silence, forced labor, and the lash. A whole town grew up around its walls, fed off its misery, and made the punishment of men into an industry. This is the entire story of Sing Sing. If this channel is new to you, a like goes a long way. We explore places like this every week, pulling apart the history that hides in plain sight. Chapter 1. Stone Upon Stone, Mount Pleasant, New York. May 14, 1825. A flotilla of flat-bottomed barges scraped against the shore of the Hudson River, 30 miles north of Manhattan. On board were roughly 100 convicts from Auburn State Prison, chained at the ankles, guarded by armed men, and led by a warden named Elam Linz, who believed that the only way to govern a criminal was to destroy his spirit entirely. Linz was a Litchfield, Connecticut native, a former hatter-turned-infantry captain during the War of 1812, who had joined the staff at Auburn Prison in 1817 and risen to warden by sheer force of will and an absolute willingness to use violence as a management tool. He had already built his reputation at Auburn by pioneering a disciplinary regime so severe that visiting reformers could not decide whether to praise it or condemn it. Now the state had given him something bigger, a chance to build a prison from nothing on his own terms, using the prisoners themselves as his construction crew. The prisoners stepped off the barges and onto a hillside of exposed dolomitic limestone. There were no walls waiting for them, no fences, no guard towers. No buildings of any kind, just the quarry, the river, and the promise that anyone who ran would be shot where they stood. Linz had been given $20,100 by the New York State Legislature, roughly $570,000 in today's money, and a single instruction: build a new prison to replace the overcrowded and discredited Newgate facility down in Greenwich Village. Newgate, built in 1797, had become a cesspool of corruption, disease, and violence. New York needed something modern, something efficient, something that would project control. Linz had scouted sites on Staten Island and in the Bronx before settling on this 130 acres at Mount Pleasant. He chose it for one reason above all others. The stone was already here. A quarry of dolomitic marble sat exposed on the hillside, ready to be cut. The prisoners would carve their own cages out of the earth beneath their feet. He had seen it done before at a prison in New Hampshire where inmates quarried the stone for their own facility. The idea appealed to something fundamental in his philosophy. The punishment begins before the first cell is occupied. The site belonged to the land once held by the Sint Sink people, a band of the Wappinger Confederacy. Sint Sink translates roughly to stone upon stone, or stony place. The village that had grown up nearby had taken the name Sing Sing when it incorporated in 1813. Within 3 years, the prison would make that name infamous across the entire country. Temporary barracks went up first, a cookhouse, a blacksmith shop. Then the quarrying began. Every morning, the prisoners were marched in lockstep to the hillside, where they cut limestone blocks by hand, hauled them to the construction site, and laid the walls of the building that would hold them. By December of 1825, 60 or so cells had been carved into the slope, and the men were doubling up inside them at night, sleeping in the walls they had built that same day. The permanent cell block was finished in October of 1828. It measured 476 feet long and 44 feet wide, with 4 tiers of 800 individual cells stacked on top of each other. Each cell was 7 feet long, 3 feet 3 inches wide, and 6 feet 7 inches tall. No indoor plumbing, no natural light, no ventilation beyond whatever air leaked through the stone. A man could lie down in his cell, but could not fully extend his arms to either side. Over the next 2 decades, a 5th and a 6th tier would be added, pushing the capacity past 1,200. By the late 1800s, the prison routinely held more than 1,600 men in a building designed for 800. Charles Bulfinch, the architect of the United States Capitol, visited the site in 1827 and praised what he called perfect retirement and privacy of the prisoners, and security against combination or escape. What he was admiring was a machine. Every dimension of the cell block was calculated to isolate, to control, and to silence. Elam Lins had a philosophy, and he stated it plainly. His goal was to reduce the prisoner to, in his own words, a silent and insulated working machine. That phrase was not a metaphor. It was a design specification. And the building he forced 100 men to construct with their own hands was the physical expression of it. In 1831, two young Frenchmen named Alexis de Tocqueville and Gustave de Beaumont arrived at Sing Sing on a mission from the French government to study America's prison system. What they found there would shape their landmark report on American democracy and broadcast the Sing Sing model to the world. The prison that 100 convicts had quarried from a hillside in Westchester County was about to become the template for how an entire nation punishes its people. This decision seemed small at the time. It wasn't. If you're finding this one worth your time, subscribing helps us keep making these deep dives. Chapter 2: The Silent Machine. To understand what daily life inside Sing Sing actually looked like, you have to understand the system that governed it. It was called the Auburn System, named after the prison where Lins had developed it. And it was built on a single organizing principle: total silence. The rival model at the time was the Pennsylvania system, practiced at Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia. Pennsylvania kept prisoners in complete solitary confinement 24 hours a day. The theory was that isolation would force a man to reflect on his sins and find God. Early experiments at Auburn had tried the same thing, locking 83 men in total solitary in 1821. Within 2 years, 5 of them had killed themselves, and most of the rest had suffered severe mental breakdowns. Lins drew a different conclusion from that disaster. Not that isolation was cruel, but that it was inefficient. He needed the prisoners working, so he designed a hybrid. Solitary cells at night, congregate labor during the day, and absolute silence at all times. No talking, no whispering, no singing, no whistling, no humming, no eye contact between prisoners, no communication of any kind, written or spoken, under any circumstances. The men moved through the prison in lockstep, a military formation in which each prisoner placed his right hand on the shoulder of the man in front of him and shuffled forward in unison. Eyes cast downward, faces turned to the right toward the guards. They wore identical striped uniforms. They ate at long tables, all facing the same direction, forbidden to look at the man next to them. They worked 10-hour days in the prison workshops, cutting stone, making shoes, assembling furniture, all of it in silence. Violations were punished with the cat-o'-nine tails, a whip made of 6 to 9 leather lashes, sometimes knotted with wire or metal barbs. At Auburn, Lins had authorized up to 100 lashes for a single infraction. At Sing Sing, the chaplain John Lucky reported individual prisoners receiving as many as 300 strokes in a single beating. The whip was not the only tool. There was a punishment called the bath, in which water was dropped from a height onto the top of a bound prisoner's shaved head, over and over until he lost consciousness. Prison records from 1852 counted 170 inflictions of the bath in that single year. There was bucking, in which a man was tied to a wooden bar, hoisted upside down and left hanging. There were iron yokes clamped around the neck. There was the ball and chain. In 1864, records show that 613 out of 796 prisoners at Sing Sing received some form of corporal punishment. One man was punished 22 separate times that year. And if you are wondering how any of this was legal, so was everyone else, eventually. Chaplain Lucky reported Lins's brutality to Governor William Seward and to the president of the Board of Inspectors. Lins was forced out as warden in 1830. He came back. Auburn rehired him in 1838. He was fired again in 1839 after a coroner ruled that an inmate had died from disease, whose fatal outcome was hastened by flogging, labor, and general harsh treatment imposed by Lins. Sing Sing, astonishingly, brought him back a third time in 1843. He lasted only months. The cat o' nine tails was finally outlawed by the New York legislature in 1848 after a series of public scandals that even the prison's defenders could no longer contain. The Auburn system itself endured far longer. It became the dominant prison model in the United States for the next 50 years, copied in state after state, praised by reformers and politicians as the most efficient way to manage large populations of convicted men. In 1826, Reverend Lewis Dwight of the Boston Prison Discipline Society had visited Sing Sing and declared the Auburn system a model worthy of the world's imitation. That endorsement carried weight. Within a decade, states across the Northeast and Midwest were building prisons modeled directly on Sing Sing's design. The cell block dimensions, the workshop layout, the silence rules, the lockstep, the disciplinary philosophy, all of it copied, often down to the architectural specifications. The Reverend's praise would age poorly. The American Alliance of Museums would eventually call Sing Sing the birthplace of mass incarceration in the United States. That description is not hyperbole. The system that Elam Lins built on that hillside in 1825 did not stay on that hillside. It became the blueprint for how an entire country would warehouse its prisoners for the rest of the century. The physical evidence of that system is still visible today. The original cell block, with its 476 feet of hand-cut stone, its tiny cells stacked 6 tiers high, its corridors designed so that a single guard could observe dozens of men in absolute silence, still stands behind Sing Sing's walls. It has no roof anymore. It has no iron. But the dimensions remain, 3 feet 3 inches wide, the width of a coffin for a living man. Not everyone at Sing Sing accepted the silence. In 1844, a woman named Eliza Farnham was appointed matron of the Mount Pleasant Female Prison, the women's facility adjacent to the main complex. Farnham overturned the silence rule for her inmates, added Charles Dickens novels to the prison library, and introduced music and educational instruction. She was forced out by 1848, the same year the cat o' nine tails was banned, but her brief tenure proved that the silence system was a choice, not a necessity. The men's prison, of course, continued as before. By the end of the 19th century, the Auburn system had faded as official doctrine, but the culture of brutality it had created lived on in the walls, the procedures, and the institutional habits of the guards who ran them. And Sing Sing was about to add a new dimension to its capacity for inflicting death, one that would define the prison for the next 70 years. Chapter 3. The House of Death. On June 4th, 1888, New York became one of the first states to adopt electrocution as its method of capital punishment. The politics behind the decision were as ugly as the method itself. Thomas Edison, locked in a commercial war with George Westinghouse over electrical current, lobbied hard for the use of Westinghouse's alternating current in the electric chair, hoping to associate his rival's product with death. The world's first execution by electric chair took place at Auburn Prison on August 6, 1890, when a man named William Kemmler was strapped into a device that had never been tested on a human being. The procedure was widely described as botched. Sing Sing's chair, the one the world would come to know as Old Sparky, was first used on July 7, 1891. That morning, beginning at 4:30, 4 men were electrocuted in sequence: James Slocum, Harris Smiler, Shibuya Jugiro, and Joseph Wood. From that day forward, Sing Sing became New York's primary killing ground. In 1920, a separate death house was constructed on the prison grounds, a self-contained facility within the larger complex designed to hold the condemned in total isolation from the general population. 24 single cells for condemned men, 3 for condemned women, with its own kitchen, hospital, visiting room, and exercise yard. The cells were arranged in a row, each one facing a narrow corridor. Executions moved there in 1922 after a series of escapes from the older death row. The walk from the holding cell to the chair was roughly 45 feet, down a corridor painted institutional green, past a row of empty cells through a heavy steel door and into the chamber itself, a small, bare room with a wooden chair bolted to the floor, straps for the wrists, ankles, and chest, and a metal cap connected to a cable that ran through the wall to the generator room. Prisoners and guards called the walk the last mile. The holding area was called the Dance Hall, a name whose dark irony was not accidental. Both phrases entered the American language through these corridors. Executions at Sing Sing followed a rigid procedure. The condemned prisoner was given a last meal, visited by a chaplain, and walked to the chamber by the warden and a detail of guards. Witnesses, usually reporters and state officials, sat in rows of wooden chairs facing the electric chair. The state executioner stood behind a partition, visible only to the warden. The prisoner was strapped in. The metal cap was placed on their head. A wet sponge was inserted beneath it to improve conductivity, and a leather mask was lowered over their face. The executioner threw the switch. The initial jolt was typically 2,000 volts, reduced after several seconds, then raised again. Death was supposed to be instantaneous. It often was not. The men who operated Old Sparky formed their own grim dynasty. Edwin F. Davis, the state's first official executioner, carried out 240 executions between 1890 and 1914, including 7 men in a single night at Sing Sing on August 12, 1912. He trained his successor, John Hulbert, who personally pulled the switch on 140 of Sing Sing's condemned. Hulbert took his own life in 1929. His successor, Robert G. Elliott, executed Ruth Snyder, the Rosenbergs, and Bruno Hauptmann. The executions that took place inside the death house were not abstractions. They were specific people who died in specific ways, and a few of them seared themselves into the public memory in ways that outlasted the prison itself. On the night of January 12, 1928, a Queens housewife named Ruth Snyder was strapped into Old Sparky for the murder of her husband, Albert. Killed for insurance money with the help of her lover, a corset salesman named Henry Judd Gray. Snyder was the first woman executed at Sing Sing since Martha Place in 1899. A photographer from the New York Daily News named Tom Howard had smuggled a single shot plate camera into the death chamber, strapped to his ankle with a cable trigger running up the inside of his trouser leg. At the moment the current hit Snyder's body, Howard crossed his legs and pressed the trigger. The photograph ran on the front page the next morning under a single word: dead. It was the first photograph of an electrocution ever published. Howard's camera eventually ended up at the Smithsonian. On January 16, 1936, a 65-year-old man named Albert Fish sat down in the same chair. Fish had been convicted of the murder and cannibalism of 10-year-old Grace Budd in 1928. He was the oldest person ever electrocuted at Sing Sing. He entered the chamber at 11:06 in the evening and was pronounced dead 3 minutes later. On March 4, 1944, 3 members of the Murder Inc. syndicate were executed in rapid succession: Louis Lepke Buchalter, Louis Capone, and Mendy Weiss. Buchalter remains the only organized crime boss in American history ever executed by the legal system. On June 19, 1953, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were put to death for conspiracy to commit espionage on behalf of the Soviet Union. Their case had consumed the nation for 2 years, generating international protest on a scale that no American criminal proceeding had ever seen. Appeals came from Pope Pius XII, Albert Einstein, and the President of France. Demonstrations erupted from Paris to Buenos Aires. A last-minute stay by Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas was vacated by the full court in special session. The executions were rescheduled from the original time to avoid falling on the Jewish Sabbath. On the evening of June 19th, a crowd of 500 gathered outside the White House in Washington, pleading for clemency. Inside Sing Sing's death house, 30 miles up the Hudson, Julius Rosenberg was led into the chamber at 8 o'clock. He died from the first electrical charge at 8:06. Ethel was brought in next. She required 5 separate jolts. Eyewitnesses in the chamber reported smoke rising from the electrode on her head. The prison physician had to confirm death twice. They remain the only American civilians ever executed for espionage during peacetime. Their sons, Michael and Robert Mirapol, adopted by family friends, have spent decades campaigning for Ethel's exoneration, arguing that declassified Soviet documents show her involvement was far less than the prosecution claimed. The last person to die in New York's electric chair was Eddie Lee Mays, executed at Sing Sing on August 15, 1963, for a robbery murder in Harlem. After that, the chair was eventually transferred to Greenhaven Correctional Facility, still in working condition, though it was never used again. Over 72 years, 614 people died in Sing Sing's electric chair. That number represents 88% of all executions carried out by the state of New York. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. Chapter 4. The Celebrity Warden. Before Lewis Laws arrived, another man tried to change Sing Sing from the inside. His name was Thomas Mott Osborne, a wealthy Auburn industrialist, a former mayor, and a man who believed that the prison system was producing criminals faster than it was rehabilitating them. In 1913, Osborne was named chairman of the New York State Commission on Prison Reform, and he decided that the only way to understand the system was to experience it from the inside. That September, he had himself voluntarily committed to Auburn Prison under the alias Tom Brown, inmate 33,333X. He spent a week living as a prisoner, sleeping on a cot in a cell, eating the food, following the rules, and enduring the dehumanization of the routine. He turned the experience into a best-selling book called Within Prison Walls that shocked the reading public with its first-hand account of what the silent system actually felt like. When Osborne was appointed warden of Sing Sing on December 1, 1914, replacing Judge George S. Weed, he went further. He spent another week incognito inside Sing Sing itself, sleeping among the inmates before revealing who he was. Then he did something no warden had done before. He walked into the yard unarmed and unescorted. He established the Mutual Welfare League, a prisoner self-government system in which inmates elected their own delegates to disciplinary and grievance committees. He ended the lockstep. He curtailed the floggings. He allowed inmates to move freely within designated areas during recreation hours. And for his trouble, his political enemies engineered a perjury indictment against him, accusing him of neglect of duty and moral impropriety. The case was transparently manufactured by Tammany Hall-aligned officials who wanted him removed. It collapsed under its own weight, and Osborne returned to Sing Sing in 1916 to a celebration from the inmates who had benefited from his reforms. He resigned anyway by the end of that year, exhausted by the political warfare. He went on to command the Portsmouth Naval Prison in New Hampshire, where he applied similar reforms, and died in 1926. The reform organization that bears his name, the Osborne Association, founded by his protege Austin McCormick, is still active today. 4 years later, Lawes took the job. Laws was born on September 13, 1883, in Elmira, New York, the son of a guard at the Elmira Reformatory. He had grown up inside the prison system, literally, and had worked his way through Clinton, Auburn, Elmira, and the Hart Island Reformatory before Governor Al Smith offered him Sing Sing in 1919. He accepted on one condition, that he could run the prison without political interference. Over the next 21 years, Laws transformed Sing Sing into something the American public had never seen before. He built a new mess hall, a chapel, a hospital, a laundry, a bathhouse, and a barbershop. He phased out the last remnants of the lockstep. He started educational programs and vocational training. He brought in the Black Sheep football team, coached and equipped by New York Giants owner Tim Mara, and the Ossining Orioles baseball team, which played in a stadium on the prison grounds that bore Laws's own name. Babe Ruth visited Sing Sing on September 5, 1929, and played an exhibition game against the Inmate team. The Giants scored 17 runs to the Inmates 3, but the crowd, men serving sentences for everything from robbery to murder, gave Ruth a standing ovation that echoed off the walls. Laws believed that a man could be reformed. He said so publicly, repeatedly, in books and on the radio. He called Sing Sing an old hellhole when he arrived, and set about trying to turn it into something resembling a human institution. He allowed inmates to form clubs, attend lectures, put on theatrical productions. He invited journalists inside the walls and gave them access that no previous warden had permitted. He cultivated relationships with politicians, publishers, and movie producers, and he used those relationships to build a national platform for prison reform. And through all of it, through every reform, every act of humanity, every gesture toward the idea that prisoners were human beings capable of change. Lewis Laws walked down to the death house and oversaw executions. 303 of them. Over 21 years, he supervised the killing of more people than any other warden in American history, while simultaneously writing one of the most famous arguments against capital punishment ever published. The contradiction was visible to everyone, including Laws himself. He wrote about it openly. He believed the death penalty was barbaric, counterproductive, and morally indefensible. He also believed that as long as it was the law, it was his duty to carry it out. Whether that makes him a hypocrite or a man trapped by his own sense of obligation depends on how much weight you give to the distinction between a person's beliefs and their actions. His 1932 book, 20,000 Years in Sing Sing, became a national bestseller. Warner Brothers bought the rights and turned it into a film starring Spencer Tracy and Bette Davis, the only movie the two of them ever appeared in together. Laws hosted a national NBC radio series of the same name from 1933 to 1939. His other books, Invisible Stripes and Chalked Out, became Humphrey Bogart and George Raft pictures. He appeared on the cover of Time magazine. Lewis Laws was, for 2 decades, the most famous prison warden in the world. When his wife Catherine died, hundreds of Sing Sing inmates were granted leave to attend her funeral. Every single one of them came back. If this is the kind of story you came for, the kind that sits with you, hit subscribe. We put hundreds of hours into each one, and there are more coming. The thing that finally broke Laws was not a policy failure or a political betrayal. It was a milk truck. On April 13, 1941, 3 inmates in the 3rd floor hospital ward, Joseph Whitey Reardon, Charles McGale, and John Patches Waters, produced revolvers that had been smuggled into the prison inside a Crowley dairy delivery truck. At around 2:30 in the morning, they shot an unarmed officer named John Hardy twice in the back, killing him. A trusty patient named McGowan Miller died of a heart attack at the sound of the gunshots. The 3 men forced another guard through a steam tunnel that ran beneath the railroad tracks bisecting the prison grounds, dropped onto the tracks, and ran into the town of Ossining. There, 2 police officers named James Fagan and William Nelson encountered them by chance at the corner of Main and Water Streets. Reardon fired through the patrol car's windshield and killed Fagan. Nelson returned fire, killing Waters with a single shot. Reardon and McGale forced a fisherman named Charles Rohr to ferry them across the Hudson to Rockland County. By dawn, a 1,000-man manhunt with bloodhounds and Coast Guard cutters had them cornered on Hook Mountain. Both were captured. They were tried in White Plains that June and executed in Sing Sing's own electric chair on June 11, 1942. Lewis Laws retired weeks after the escape in July 1941. He died of a cerebral hemorrhage on April 23, 1947, at his home in Garrison, New York. He was 63 years old. Chapter 5. The Empire. The violence inside the walls was only half the story. The other half was the economy that grew up around them. From the moment the first block of limestone was cut in 1825, Sing Sing was designed to generate revenue. The prison sat on top of a quarry of dolomitic marble, and the inmates were the labor force that extracted it. For decades, Sing Sing marble was one of the most sought-after building materials on the East Coast. It was used to construct Lyndhurst, the Gothic Revival mansion in Tarrytown that would later become the home of railroad baron Jay Gould. It built Grace Church on Broadway in Manhattan. Parts of Albany City Hall were cut from stone quarried by Sing Sing prisoners. So was Calvary Baptist Church in the village of Sing Sing itself, a building made from the labor of the men imprisoned next door. When free workers in the local stone industry protested the unfair competition of unpaid prison labor, Sing Sing diversified. By 1854, 73% of the prison's inmates were under contract labor, producing not just cut stone, but furniture, carpets, shoes, bedding, cigars, harnesses, hats, wooden barrels, kitchen utensils, brass and iron castings, cabinetry, saddler hardware, and locks. A later Bureau of Municipal Research report from 1916 added to the inventory. Official stationery, beds, school desks, brooms, mats, blankets, towels, stockings, ash cans, and even manhole covers. The prison had become a factory complex with a captive workforce, operating at industrial scale. Private contractors paid the prison for access to the inmates. The money went into the prison treasury and frequently into the warden's pockets. Mark Gatto's research into prison records documented the extent of the corruption. Contractors gained influence over discipline directly. If an inmate wasn't producing fast enough, a contractor could request that the man be punished. He would be flogged and sent back to the workshop. A malingering prisoner wasn't just a disciplinary problem. He was a breach of contract. The Correctional Association of New York's 1885 Special Committee investigated the arrangement and called it effectively slavery. The system survived until the unions killed it. Samuel Gompers and the American Federation of Labor campaigned for decades against prison contract labor, arguing that it undercut free workers and depressed wages across entire industries. New York finally banned it through a series of laws between 1888 and 1894, culminating in a state constitutional amendment that prohibited the sale of prison-made goods on the open market. By 1895, the contracts were gone. Warden A. Bush complained publicly that over 1,000 men are now locked in their cells with nothing to do. The sudden idleness created its own problems. Men who had been working 10-hour days in the workshops now sat in their cells for 23 hours at a stretch. A compromise emerged. Inmates would produce goods only for use by the state itself: stationery for government offices, furniture for courthouses, uniforms for other institutions. That state use model survives today through CoreCraft, New York's prison industries program. The prison's influence on the surrounding town was total and inescapable. Its wardenship was a patronage appointment controlled by Albany, and whoever held that job controlled the hiring of guards, the awarding of supply contracts, and the allocation of inmate labor, all of which shaped the local economy. The political power that came with the wardenship made it a prize worth fighting for. Between 1913 and 1916 alone, the job turned over roughly 9 times, a revolving door driven by political maneuvering in the state capitol. Thomas Mott Osborne's perjury indictment was engineered by Tammany-aligned officials who wanted him out. Lewis Laws survived as long as he did, partly because he cultivated enough media fame to make firing him politically costly. The prison employed roughly 900 people as recently as 2019, making it the single largest employer in the village of Ossining. The Metro North Hudson line runs directly through the prison grounds on a 4-track right-of-way, with 4 bridges connecting the 2 halves of the facility. Commuters riding the train from Grand Central to Croton Harmon pass through Sing Sing every day, most of them never realizing what the walls on either side of the tracks actually are. And the name itself became a problem. By the late 1890s, with Sing Sing's reputation cemented by the electric chair and the tabloid press, the citizens of the surrounding village had had enough. Letters addressed to Sing Sing, New York, were assumed to be going to the prison. Goods manufactured by free businesses in the village were stamped "Made in Sing Sing" and boycotted by buyers who thought they were prison products. On March 25, 1901, the village voted to rename itself Ossining, drawing on the same Algonquian root, Ossin, meaning stone, but distancing itself from the 2 words that had become synonymous with punishment. The irony came 84 years later. In 1970, the state had followed the village's lead and renamed the prison Ossining Correctional Facility. By 1983, the town's merchants realized that the Sing Sing brand was actually worth something. Tourists wanted to see the famous prison. The name had cultural cachet. The village lobbied successfully to have the prison's name restored. And in 1985, it became Sing Sing Correctional Facility once again. A town that had changed its own name to escape the prison's shadow spent the next decade trying to get the shadow back. Chapter 6. Up the River. The phrases that Sing Sing gave the English language are so deeply embedded that the people who use them have no idea where they came from. Up the River originated around 1891 as a reference to the 30-mile trip convicts made up the Hudson from the Tombs, Manhattan City Jail, to Sing Sing's receiving dock. New York City magistrates would sentence a man, and within days he would be on a boat heading north. the Manhattan skyline shrinking behind him, the Palisades rising on the western bank, the river narrowing as the boat passed Yonkers and Hastings and Tarrytown, until the walls of Sing Sing appeared on the eastern shore. Sent up the river became shorthand for any prison sentence in any state, anywhere in the country. Few of the people who used it knew they were describing a specific boat trip on a specific river to a specific prison. The Big House was 1920s underworld slang, whose original referent was Sing Sing, later generalized to mean any large prison, and cemented into the national vocabulary by the 1930 MGM film of the same name, which was partly shot on location. The last mile was roughly a 45-foot walk from the holding cell to the electric chair inside the death house. All three entered American English through Sing Sing's corridors, and all three outlived the specific realities they described. Hollywood discovered Sing Sing because Lewis Laws let them in. The Warner Brothers film, 20,000 Years in Sing Sing, was released in 1932. Angels with Dirty Faces followed in 1938 with James Cagney. Invisible Stripes in 1939, based on Laws's novel, starred George Raft and Humphrey Bogart. Castle on the Hudson in 1940, a remake of the Tracy film, starred John Garfield. For a decade, Sing Sing was as much a brand as a prison, and its warden was the one licensing the rights. The prison also produced a roster of inmates whose names became permanent fixtures in American crime history. Willie the Actor Sutton, the bank robber who famously said he robbed banks because that is where the money is, escaped from Sing Sing in December 1932 by sawing through his cell bars and scaling the wall with two ladders lashed together with wire. He was at large for more than a year before being recaptured in Philadelphia in February 1934. Charles Lucky Luciano, the architect of the modern American mafia, passed through Sing Sing during intake and transfer in the summer of 1936 on his way to serve a 30 to 50-year sentence for compulsory prostitution. He returned briefly in January 1946 before being deported to Italy. Albert Fish was imprisoned there twice, first for embezzlement in 1903, decades before his crimes as a serial killer were known, and then on death row in 1935 before his execution the following January. Charles Chapin, the tyrannical editor of the New York Evening World, a man so feared in newsrooms that his reporters called him the cruelest editor in New York, was sentenced to Sing Sing in 1918 for the murder of his wife. He spent the rest of his life there and became known as the Rose Man of Sing Sing for the elaborate rose gardens he cultivated on the prison grounds. Gardens that wardens and visitors admired for decades. David Berkowitz, the son of Sam, was briefly held at Sing Sing after his sentencing in June 1978 before being transferred to Clinton and then Attica. Ferdinand Ward, the Gilded Age con artist whose Ponzi scheme bankrupted Ulysses S. Grant's family in 1884, served his sentence at Sing Sing in the 1880s. The prison's inmate roster, read in full, is a timeline of American crime from the Civil War to the present. In 2024, a new chapter opened. The A24 film Sing Sing, directed by Greg Quaidar, told the story of the Rehabilitation through the arts program that had been operating inside the prison since 1996, founded by Catherine Vawkins. The film was based on a 2005 Esquire article by John H. Richardson called The Sing Sing Follies, and it starred Coleman Domingo as RTA alumnus John Divine G. Whitfield, alongside Clarence Divine I. Macklin, a former Sing Sing inmate playing himself. The majority of the cast were formerly incarcerated RTA alumni, men who had discovered theater inside a maximum security prison and carried it with them when they got out. The film was made for under $2 million. Director Greg Quaidar told Deadline that a project on the Sing Sing scale that traditionally would have cost $5 million could be made for under $2 million on a community-driven model. It premiered at the Toronto International Film Festival in 2023, was released theatrically by A24 on July 12, 2024, and grossed over $5 million worldwide against that minuscule budget. It received Oscar nominations for Best Actor, Best Adapted Screenplay, and Best Original Song. And in January 2025, it became the first major American film released into U.S. correctional facilities simultaneously with its public run. Distributed through the Adovo tablet platform so that incarcerated men and women across the country could watch a film about what happens when a prison decides to let its inmates create something instead of just survive. 200 years of history, and the same walls keep generating stories. Chapter 7. Breaking Out, Breaking Down. Escapes from Sing Sing are nearly as old as the prison itself. Records document successful breakouts in almost every decade of the 1800s, with as many as 5 in a single year. The most spectacular happened in 1875. 5 inmates who had been assigned to work on the railroad track that runs directly through the middle of the prison grounds rushed an armed locomotive as it moved through the yard. They overpowered the engineer and fireman, uncoupled the engine from the rest of the train, and raced away on it. What they did not know was that the engineer, before losing control of the cab, had shut off the water supply to the boiler. The locomotive ran out of steam before it could reach the Hudson. 4 of the 5 were recaptured. One reportedly made it to England, where, according to local legend, he opened a pub. Willie Sutton's 1932 escape was more methodical. Sentenced to 30 years for jewelry store robbery, Sutton spent weeks smuggling hacksaw blades into his cell and cutting through the iron bar. On the night of December 11th, he and fellow inmate Johnny Egan slipped out, surprised a trustee in a basement beneath the mess hall, lashed 2 ladders together, and went over the wall at an unguarded point. Sutton was not caught until February 1934, more than a year later, in Philadelphia. The April 1941 escape, the milk truck breakout that killed Officer Hardy and Patrolman Fagan, was the deadliest in the prison's history, and the event that ended the law's era. Its details have already been told. The last major crisis at Sing Sing was not an escape. It was a siege. On the evening of Saturday, January 8, 1983, a confrontation between inmates in Cell Block B and a corrections officer named Alexander Cunningham escalated into a full-scale takeover. Prisoners released for evening recreation barricaded the doors to the 5-tier cell block, which held 618 men, and seized 19 corrections officers as hostages. The standoff lasted 53 hours, the worst prison uprising in New York since the Attica Revolt of 1971 that had killed 43 people. The memory of Attica, where Governor Nelson Rockefeller had ordered an armed assault that killed 33 inmates and 10 hostages, hung over every decision made during the Sing Sing crisis. Inmates hung bedsheet banners from the upper tiers that read, "We don't want another Attica." The message was directed at the newly inaugurated Governor Mario Cuomo, who had taken office just 8 days earlier. Cuomo refused to negotiate substantively until hostages were released. Behind the scenes, corrections officials and state mediators worked the phones for 2 days. On Monday evening, January 10th, after the deployment of a corrections emergency response team to the perimeter, the inmates released all 19 hostages unharmed. Their demands centered on overcrowding. The prison was operating at roughly 130% of capacity, with men sleeping in gymnasiums and corridors, along with chronic idleness, restricted mail access, limited visiting hours, and inadequate access to the law library. Nobody died. That was the achievement. The aftermath told a different story. Instead of addressing the overcrowding and systemic failures that had caused the revolt, New York responded with a massive prison construction program. Over the next decade, the state built dozens of new correctional facilities upstate, most of them in rural communities that had lost their manufacturing base and welcomed the jobs. Sentencing laws grew harsher under both Cuomo and his successor, George Pataki. New York's incarcerated population climbed from roughly 35,000 in 1983 to over 70,000 by the late 1990s. Historians, including Lee Bernstein of SUNY New Paltz, have argued that the peaceful resolution of the Sing Sing revolt, paradoxically, made it easier for politicians to avoid confronting the conditions that caused it. The crisis was contained. The system did not have to change. It just had to get bigger. Chapter 8. The Ruins and the Reckoning. The original cell block that 100 Auburn convicts cut from the hillside in 1825 is still standing. What remains of it? In 1943, the last prisoners were moved out of the 1825 block, and its iron bars and cell doors were donated to the World War II scrap metal drive. For the next 4 decades, the emptied structure was used for record storage, light manufacturing, and at one point a boxing ring where inmates fought under fluorescent lights in a building that had once held men in total silence. In 1984, a fire destroyed the roof. No one rebuilt it. Today, the 1825 cell block is a roofless stone ruin behind Sing Sing's outer wall. 476 feet of hand-cut marble open to the sky, listed on the National Register of Historic Places, never again to be used as a detention facility. Weeds grow from the mortar joints. Trees have taken root inside cells where men once lay 3 feet apart in the dark. The Hudson River is visible through gaps in the stone that were not there 100 years ago. Nearby sits the 1936 Art Modern Powerhouse, the coal-fired plant that generated the electricity for the entire prison complex, including Old Sparky. It is a striking building even in decay, with clean geometric lines and the kind of industrial confidence that Depression-era architects brought to public works. It has been derelict for decades, repurposed as a garage, staff locker rooms, and general storage. Water stains run down the concrete walls. The generator room that once fed 2,000 volts into a wooden chair now holds maintenance equipment. The building sits just outside the secure perimeter, slowly deteriorating, a structure that once powered a death chamber, now holding mops and filing cabinets. The railroad still runs through the middle of it all. The Metro North trains pass through the prison grounds dozens of times a day, and the passengers, commuters reading their phones or watching the river, are separated from the yard by nothing more than a fence and 100 feet of air. Sing Sing in 2026 is a place of overlapping timelines. The ruins of the 1825 cell block share the same 55-acre site with an active maximum security facility that still holds roughly 1,500 to 1,700 incarcerated men. The New York State Department of Corrections and Community Supervision lists Sing Sing Correctional Facility at 354 Hunter Street, Ossining, as operational. It runs programs in adult basic education, GED preparation, vocational training in carpentry, computers, electrical work, plumbing, welding, and small engine repair. Hudson Link for Higher Education in Prison, founded by Ann Reisner after the 1998 cancellation of state and federal funding for college programs behind bars, offers degree-granting courses. And the Rehabilitation Through the Arts program, founded by Catherine Vawkins in 1996, the same program that inspired the Oscar-nominated film, reports that fewer than 3% of its participants return to prison within 3 years. The national recidivism rate is over 60%. The conditions behind the walls, however, have not kept pace with the programs. Reporting by The Appeal in 2025, based on accounts from incarcerated writer James Sheffield, described persistent overcrowding, deteriorating heating and ventilation systems, and an atmosphere one inmate called a war zone. These are conditions consistent with what Governor Cuomo's own inquiry found more than 40 years earlier, after the 1983 revolt. And now, 200 years after the first stone was cut, Sing Sing is becoming a museum. The Sing Sing Prison Museum Project, led by the nonprofit Sing Sing Prison Museum, Inc. in partnership with historic Hudson River towns, has been in development in one form or another since at least the late 1980s. The original plan, floated around 2002, envisioned a $5 million conversion of the 1936 powerhouse and an adjacent retired cell block into a full museum complex. By 2007, the village had applied for $12.5 million in federal funding against an estimated total cost of $14 million. The full-scale concept eventually grew to include a secured 300-foot corridor through the prison wall to the 1825 cell block itself, at an estimated cost of $45 million. New York State supported the effort with at least $3.3 million in early grants, and Ossining received a $10 million Downtown Revitalization Initiative grant in 2021 that incorporated the museum. After repeated delays and the logistical challenge of building inside an active prison perimeter, the project shifted in 2022 from the Powerhouse to the 1865 Olive Opera House at 63 to 67 Central Avenue in Ossining. a 13,000 square foot building that once hosted traveling theater companies and village dances. On February 10, 2025, a ceremonial wall breaking marked the start of construction. Among the attendees was John Adrian J.J. Velasquez, a wrongfully convicted Sing Sing Rehabilitation through the Arts alumnus, released in 2021 after 23 years behind bars, who now serves as a museum consultant. The development has been guided by Brent D. Glass, former director of the Smithsonian National Museum of American History, who has described leading tours through the 1825 cell block as walking through a ghostly ruin. Funding has come from the National Endowment for the Humanities, which awarded a $364,000 challenge grant in 2021, the Mellon Foundation, American Express, the Toe Foundation, and a $2.5 million Lilly Endowment grant pledged in 2025 for programming on the history of religion and prisons. The museum has raised close to $5 million toward its first phase. The grand opening is planned for 2026, timed to coincide with the prison's bicentennial. Walking tours of the prison perimeter resumed for the public on weekends starting in April 2025. 200 years ago, 100 men in chains were ordered to cut a prison out of a quarry of stone. They built the walls, they built the cells, they built the corridors and the workshops and the killing rooms. They built a place that would hold them, and tens of thousands after them, in silence. Today, those same walls stand open to the sky. The marble has no roof, the iron is gone, melted down for a war that ended 80 years ago. Rain falls into the cells where men once lay in the dark, 3 feet apart, forbidden to speak. The town outside changed its name and then changed it back. The chair was carted off to another prison and never used again. The warden who made the place famous died at 63, 6 years after the escape that ended his career. The phrase "up the river" outlived all of them. And the quarry where it started, the stony place the Sing Sing people named centuries before any of this began, is still there. The stone endures. The question is whether the country that built Sing Sing is willing to look at what it carved into it. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone, and subscribe if you haven't. We'll be back inside another one of these places soon.